Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in to the Panda Props and Costumes channel. Today we are making Squid Game Soldier Masks. I really enjoyed the show and I made a few masks for myself and a few friends, and I've been getting tons of questions about the best way to print the mask, the best way to do the strapping, and some of the other little accessories that you might need to actually get the mask to look and feel like the ones from the show. So let's get right to it. So at the time I started making this video in early October, there weren't that many Squid Game Soldier Masks available, but since that time there have been tons of models available, and I purchased this particular model from Cults 3D, in particular because the hole pattern, the sort of vented hole pattern on it I felt was pretty accurate to the show. And I'll talk about some of the interesting bits that I modified along the way. I use Prusa Slicer for all of my printers, and I had supports set at about 10%. I did add supports because I wanted the top of the mask to print really well. There's a bit of an overhang and I didn't want like droopy filament on the top there. So I'm printing at 0.2 resolution with 3 perimeter walls and about 10% infill on rectilinear. This is my Under 3 Pro. You can see I've added a brim to the print just to get a little bit better adhesion. I'm using a spring steel plate with a PEI surface, and you can see it prints and adheres really well, and it pops off really easily as well too. Here I'm just about to remove some of the support material using Prusa Slicer and the stock support settings. The supports remove really easily, so it's a really clean print. You can also see that the holes are really easy to see through, the sort of mesh pattern. Again, it was really accurate to the show. And here's a little bit of leftover material. It's fairly easier to remove, again, using Prusa Slicer. I used Cura many years ago, but I haven't used Cura in probably the last couple of years. I noticed that the mask didn't have any sort of top tabs to have a strap going over the top of the head. So I modeled one in Fusion 360 and printed off a couple tabs and glued them to the top of the mask. So on sort of a later version of the mask, I ended up adding the tabs in 3D in using Mesh Mixer, but for this particular mask I took a picture of it and posted it on my Facebook page, and a friend wanted it like right away, so I didn't have time to reprint the whole mask. So I just glued the tabs on that I need to be glued on. I like to sand my parts before I glue anything, and I'm using some side grip adhesive, and it's actually an adhesive meant for acrylics, but it's side grip or well done number 6, I believe. And once you sand your parts and apply some of that adhesive on there, it glues pretty quick. It tacks up really fast, and basically in about 15 minutes it's super solid. Here I am, I'm just kind of cleaning up some of the edges and some of the brim that was on the print at the time. I do also like to kind of sand off areas that I know are going to be joined together with glue, and just provides a little bit better adhesion. This particular mask, it sort of fits together inside a little groove, and then there's these little sort of pins that you sort of push in on the side. Now this particular mask, it doesn't slide back and forth like the show, but honestly, I mean, that's kind of a neat little gimmick and feature, but I'm going to be wearing the mask, or my friend's going to be wearing the mask all the time, and it doesn't need to fold up, so I didn't really felt I needed to find a mask that had that feature. I'm just using some Bob Smith Industries CA glue. It gives me a little bit more work time for this particular part of the mask. And I'm putting some glue in the holes and the junction points as well too. I really like the Bob Smith Industries line of CA glues. They work really well, better than other brands I've worked with before. And I'm just applying some on just sort of every surface and making sure that I'm getting some in the holes as well too. And this particular glue, it just gives me a little bit more flexibility and work time to put the halves together. And here I am, I'm just joining them up and making sure that everything is aligned properly. And then I'm pushing in those little pins on the side, and that'll keep it all nice and neatly in place. It's fairly easy to mask to put together. Now I've seen some models where the mask is actually in one piece. This was really easy to print because the mask was in 2 pieces, and you can have that surface flat on the bed without needing a ton of supports. Again, I was talking about the tabs for the mask straps. This particular mask had these really small tabs on it at the time. I think they've changed the model since, and I really wanted to use 1-inch elastic, which is kind of what I recognized was being used on the show. So I modeled up some new tabs, and I grinded or dremelled off the original tabs and then just glued the new ones on. I'll be sharing these models in the show notes below, so you can download these models. Here in this particular version of the mask, I actually went in and added the tabs in on the 3D model itself and then merged it all together in Mesh Mixer, and you can see now it's printing perfectly. This is a little bit more accurate, so instead of having to glue tabs on, they're already integrated into the model and they'll just print perfectly. Okay, now I'm ready to do the masking for the shapes that are on the outside of the mask. For this particular part of the video, you can see I sort of just like did it old school. I used a ruler and made all these pencil marks, and I kind of like masked it out with masking tape. Oh, there's got to be a better way to do this. So what I did was I modeled up some paint templates. I basically created sort of a skin structure of what the mask was. I took some measurements, and then in 3D I made these templates up. So there's sort of an outer template and then an inner template. So on this particular view, you can see the triangle template being made and the circle template being made at the same time. The inner shapes, I actually just cut them in half so that I could get them flat onto the bed, and that way I don't need to print those with any sort of structure. Everything here is like kind of a convex shape, so you kind of want to try to not use supports if possible. On this particular triangle part, I had to use supports because the piece was so tall, but they're fairly easy to use. Again, I've shared these models on Thingiverse, and I'll put some links in the show notes. And again, I've glued the insides of the shapes with just some CA glue, and here you can see it lines up really nice. All I do is line up the top of the shape with the center of the mask, and then that'll ensure that the shape is centered on your mask. So I kind of felt just, these shapes, I wanted to get them a little bit consistent and share them with the community, because people seem to be kind of confused as to like how big those shapes were and how to get them to look a little bit more like the show. So looking at a lot of screenshots and stuff, I felt I did a decent job with getting it to look like the show. Here's the square one being done. I put little holes in the top. They're not really holes, they're just little indentations so that to help you better line up your mask, and so long as you line up those little indentations with the sort of center tab of the mask, everything will line up nicely. And what I decided to do, you could do this a couple different ways. You could just take the mask template, put it on and tape it in place, and then paint it. Now you have to be really careful when you're doing this, because if you don't have the template pressed down nice and firm onto the mask, you're going to get underspray sort of creeping underneath. So I'm going to show a little demonstration where I kind of do it both ways, right? So for this particular, the triangle mask, I just taped down the template, and then I used some rare earth magnets to hold down the middle part. Now I only used one magnet here, but later on in the video you'll see I used 2 magnets to prevent that piece from shifting around. And I used a couple other magnets around the perimeter just to kind of push down on that triangle. The print didn't come out exactly the same shape as the mask, so I kind of had to use magnets to sort of squish it down. You'll see I did get a little bit of underspray afterwards, but I'll show you a way to fix that. And I just used masking tape and some paper towels wrapped around the mask to make sure that overspray didn't affect the rest of the mask. So here I am now painting the white onto the mask. I'm using duplicolor white primer, actually. So I find that the white primer sort of gets a little bit better coverage. And a trick here is that you don't want to be spraying super close, and you don't want to hose down this print. Well, I did about 3 or 4 really light coats from a fair distance away, probably like 10 inches away. And that was just to ensure, or try to make it so that no paint kind of crept underneath. Now it's hard because you're painting on a mesh material. The paint will have a tendency to want to kind of creep under, because the paint's going to want to go where there's least resistance, so it's going to want to flow underneath. Now there's a couple little marks, but I'll show you how to clean them off afterwards, and it ended up looking perfectly fine. You couldn't really tell that there was any overspray at all. So here I am, I'm just peeling off all the magnets and all the masking tape and paper towel, and then taking the templates off, and you can see what the triangle looks like on the mask. And I think on the right side of the triangle there, there was a little bit of overspray. So all I did was I took a Q-tip and a little bit of paint thinner. This is just paint thinner, I think, for enamels, but almost any kind of paint thinner will work. And I just cleaned up the edge with a Q-tip, and it was perfectly fine. So here I'm demonstrating how the paint template, an alternative way for it to work. I just essentially trace the shape with a pencil once I had it kind of lined up in place. So if you don't want to use the paint template itself as a paint mask, you can still just use it as a template to be able to draw some lines on it. What I did here was I traced the pencil out, and then I didn't have any pinstripe masking tape, so I just cut some narrow strips with some blue 3M masking tape, and then I basically went around the perimeter of the circle. So again, if you don't want to use the paint template as it is, or you're worried about paint bleeding through, you can kind of do it the old school way as well too. The benefit of using these sort of paint templates is that if you're making multiple masks, or if you're making a mask for a group of friends, at least you all kind of look the same, right? You don't have like wonky shapes, or circles where some are big or some are small, or maybe they're just not like kind of perfectly geometric. This is just an easier way to do it. So instead of cutting the inner circle, I still use the magnet trick to hold down the printed template that I made, or the mask template that I made, and just a couple magnets were enough to basically hold it in place. So just be really careful with these rare earth magnets. They can kind of pinch your fingers if you're not careful, and just make sure that you've got this thing nicely centered before you start your painting. So once I've got that in place, I can start masking out the outside areas just like I did on the other mask, right? So I'm using some 1-inch blue tape and going around the perimeter of the mask, and then I'll be doing the same trick that I did before, which was using the masking tape and some paper towel to block off the outside of the mask. And here we go. I've finished painting. Again, 3 to 4 coats of Duplicolor white sandable primer, and the circle turned out really, really well. Again, there's a tiny little bit of bleed just on the left side, or whatever, right side of the mask there, and same thing as I did before. I just used a Q-tip and a little bit of paint thinner and was able to clean that up. So moving on to the assembly of the mask itself, had a lot of questions about how to do the strapping. So I found out that the original buckle for the rear of the mask is a 1-inch YKK 3-way snap buckle. Now, I didn't have time to order any of these, and I think they were like about $13, $14 each, was really expensive, I thought, for a plastic buckle. So I 3D modeled my own buckle, and I shared the model on Thingiverse, again, links below. But essentially, it's kind of like an angled buckle that's curved. Maybe it's used for backpacks or something like that. And I just sanded both sides, after printing it, the model was cut in half so I could print it on the bed really easily. And then I glued the halves together with CA glue. And some other materials that you're going to need some 1-inch sliders, and you're going to need some 1-inch fabric elastic. So this part's actually pretty simple to assemble the mask, but again, I had people asking lots of questions of like, they couldn't really figure it out. So I thought, okay, I'll walk through the whole process. So you want to cut 3, maybe 12-inch pieces of elastic. Now, if you don't want to you could actually sew the elastic to the front of the mask. On the show, I believe that's how it's done. The front of the mask, the elastic's actually sewn to the brackets on the mask. But here, if you don't want to do any sewing, you can just get some of those sliders and you can assemble the whole mask essentially without sewing anything. So all I did was I fed the elastic through the slider, and then through the mask, and then back through the slider, okay? And then that way it leaves the elastic exposed so that you can adjust it for the tension. Here I'm attaching the rear buckle. So you want to, again, put a slider on the end of the elastic and then insert it through the top of the buckle. This is actually visible. This slider is actually visible on the mask. You can see it throughout the show when people take off their masks. And obviously you need some way to be able to adjust it. So again, slide the slider on, slide it through the top of the buckle, and then slide it back through the slider so that the strap is exposed at the back, and you can adjust the tension if you need to. Now, I know this part's kind of maybe unique. Not everyone has a mannequin head that they can work with, but I've had this one for a while, and I found that it's actually the same size as my head. So just for me, out of convenience, it was easy to figure out, how long the straps needed to be using this mannequin head. I'm just taping the top of it in place, but obviously you can try it on your own head and, adjust the straps to fit. So for the side of the mask, it's pretty much the same thing. Feed the slider through, and then slide the end of it through the tab on the side of the mask, and then feed it back through the slider. And then you're going to be doing essentially the same thing for the rear of the mask, but for the rear buckle, you don't really need to have another slider. It's not, this isn't like rock climbing gear or something, right? You don't need to make it, you know, super heavy duty. And I found that if the elastic was sort of a decent quality, if it was thick enough, you could feed it through this back part and then just leave it as is. I know some people have been using thinner elastic, and that buckle won't necessarily hold it in place. Well, then you maybe need to put another slider on, or maybe you need to get some thicker elastic, right? But basically, you repeat the process for the front and or the left and right side, and after you've test fit it, you can trim the elastic if you need to. The mask pretty much sits at the top of your head and on the bottom of your chin. Now, if you feel that you need a little bit more comfort, you could always glue a little bit of foam inside. I'm just demonstrating with a piece of foam there, but you probably want to use some like 1/2-inch foam. Now, you don't need to have the elastics pulled super tight, okay? The mask just needs to be able to sit comfortably on your head and just be able to rest on the top of the head and the bottom of your chin. So it's pretty straightforward at this point. Just make some adjustments and it'll fit great. I had a lot of fun making these masks, and I've had friends enjoy them as well too. So I hope this process was helpful for you in explaining how to print the mask and how to put it all together. All right, so thanks for tuning in. Happy Halloween. Go out there and enjoy Squid Game.